Hello everybody, this is Jason Baker and welcome to our hands-on video focused on AWS CodeDeploy. Now we can use AWS CodeDeploy to automatically deploy build artifacts to servers in our cloud environment. If you recall the previous hands-on video, we used AWS CodeBuild to build an artifact using a simple Java application, and we stored that artifact in an S3 bucket. Now imagine you could take that S3 artifact and automatically deploy it to multiple servers. Now in our previous example, deploying a very simple Java application like that wouldn't really do much. But imagine that output artifact was a web application. You could automatically take that web application and deploy it to an entire fleet of web servers. And that's the sort of exercise that we are going to simulate here today. And we're going to use the AWS CodeDeploy service to automatically deploy a web package for us. And the web package contains our website, and it contains an Appspec file that describes to CodeDeploy how exactly to install our website files. Okay, well, we're going to get started here, and the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go into CloudFormation, and we're going to deploy a new stack. We're going to create a stack. The stack is going to be a stack called app CodeDeploy template.yaml. And this is a template file. This is a template that will create a stack that contains a number of different components. It will deploy a stack that has a VPC with a subnet and a set of web servers and an elastic load balancer. And it will also deploy an app, a CodeDeploy application definition for us. So we will, once we've deployed this environment, we will be able to use the CodeDeploy service to deploy a web application to the servers that have been deployed by CloudFormation. So you can think of this stack is basically building a very small sort of web server environment that's simulating a production environment, along with the CodeDeploy configuration necessary to deploy the web application to that environment. Okay, well, we're going to create our new stack here. So we'll click on Next. We'll give it a stack name. We'll just call it something like our web application stack. And there's a couple parameters that we can set. We'll just use the default values. There's an auto scaling group that's instantiated. The auto scaling group then will launch a couple web servers. The web servers in this case are using they're actually just using a recent version of the Amazon Linux 2 AMI, at least at the time that this video was recorded, in their T2 micro instance types. We'll click on Next, scroll to the bottom and click on Next again, and acknowledge that we might create IAM resources. Click on the Create Stack button. Now this will take, well, it might take about 5 or so minutes to launch all of the resources in the stack. So what I'll do here is I will pause the video and wait for the resources to be complete. Okay, so after about 5 minutes, our stack launch is complete, and we can look at the resources that have been created. There's an S3 bucket, an artifact bucket that was created, an elastic load balancer, a VPC with a public subnet and route, a web server security group, an auto scaling group that was created. So all of these resources have been created for us, including a CodeDeploy application, which we'll look at here shortly. If I look at some of the output of the stack, you'll see that there is an ELB endpoint that's output, and this represents the endpoint of the elastic load balancer. If I open that up in a new tab window, you'll see that there's an Nginx web server essentially running on each of the web servers that the load balancer is proxying. And all we can see right now is the default Nginx web page, because we haven't actually deployed our website to these web servers. So let's look at that next here. Well, to deploy our web application, what we need to do is essentially simulate what the code build service did in the previous assignment, which is to store an artifact package in the artifact bucket. And I've changed to the S3 web console here, where you can see a web application artifact bucket was created by our CloudFormation stack. And what I want to do is I want to copy in a web package to this bucket. And this package is going to contain our website along with an Appspec file that will tell the CodeDeploy service how to deploy the website. Now this website package is available in the class S3 bucket, and there's a link to that website.zip file in the lecture presentation. I'm going to go and I've already downloaded that file to my local system, and I'm going to upload it into this bucket. So I will upload and I'll add a file. This file is located in my downloads directory, so I'm going to select the website file. And one thing to note is that, and if you recall this from the previous hands-on video, there's a bucket policy in place on this S3 artifact bucket, which says that any objects that are uploaded into the bucket must be encrypted. And so in this case, if I were to just try to upload this file right now, it would actually fail, because I'm not specifying any encryption settings for the file that I'm going to store in the bucket. I'll go down to the property section then, and I want to specify that we're going to use an encryption key. We'll override the default encryption bucket settings, and we are going to use the AWS key managed service, and we'll use an AWS managed key to encrypt this file. Okay, now I'll click the upload button, and you should see that the file is uploaded into the S3 bucket properly. Now, if you had a problem doing that, it's because you didn't set the encryption properly. Again, you can't upload a file into this that is unencrypted. Okay, so now we have our artifact repository. We have uploaded our package into the repository. The next thing we're going to do is go to the CodeDeploy dashboard. in AWS. And we go to the CodeDeploy dashboard and we look at deployments. There are no deployments yet because we haven't triggered any. We click on applications and we can see an application that has been configured for CodeDeploy. And this application is going to deploy packages to EC2 instances. You can deploy to other types of compute resources in AWS, but for the purposes of our class, we're just going to use EC2. I'll click on this application name, and we can see that as part of this application name, we have defined a deployment group. The deployment group is basically describing the targets of the deployment. If I click on the deployment group, then we can see a bunch of configuration information. It's basically telling us how it's going to deploy to these instances. For example, the deployment configuration is going to use the one at a time deployment process. And what that will do basically is, remember, we launched a stack that created an auto-scaling group. We decided that the auto-scaling group would create 2 web servers. And the one at a time deployment configuration will update and deploy the web application to each server one at a time. So this is not a, you can think of this as a rolling deployment, right? It's not a big bang deployment where we're going to try to update all the servers out all at once. We're just going to update one server at a time. Okay. And so this looks good. We can also look at maybe some of the settings for the application. There's really no settings. These are notification rules to notify us when a deployment happens, but there's not going to be any notifications. We can also see all kinds of different deployment configurations that we could choose from. These are predefined deployment configurations that we can select. We can also create custom deployment configurations as well. But again, we're just going to use the one at a time deployment configuration, which will ensure that there's at least one minimum healthy host available at any given time. Okay, we'll go back to the applications, click on our application, deployment group, and we're going to create a deployment. Click on the Create Deployment button, and the Create Deployment is going to, again, we've specified a deployment group here. Next, we need to tell the service where our application package is located. And our application is stored in Amazon S3, and it's located in a particular bucket. So what we need to do there is I'm going to copy this bucket name, our artifact bucket, and we'll specify that as a S3 URL format or URI format, and we'll specify the package name. So it's going to look something like that. S3, and then our bucket name, web application artifact bucket, and then some random alphanumeric characters, /website.zip is the name of our package that we want to deploy. It's a zip file, which it figured out based upon the name of the package. And if we scroll down here, we'll just pretty much select all of the all of leave all the default values alone. For deployment group overrides, again, we've selected the CodeDeploy one at a time model, so we will continue to use that deployment configuration. So everything I think looks good. Let's go ahead and click on the Create Deployment button. And now a deployment has been created. And what you will see during this deployment process is a set of activities here where it's going to update each instance one at a time. And there's a series of events that will occur as these instances are updated. So go ahead and click on the View Events link here to see the different events that are happening and watch those events progressively. This whole process takes maybe about 10 or 15 minutes. So I want you to kind of check out the status and check out the events that are occurring during the deployment process. And again, it's updating each server one at a time. So while it's doing this, I'm going to, again, pause the video and we'll wait for the deployment to complete. Okay, well, that deployment took about 10 minutes or so, and you should see that both of the EC2 instances were successfully deployed to. If we look at the events for one of the instances, you'll see that there are quite a few different events that happen. One of the things that happens is the load balancer will basically quiesce or block traffic to an instance while it is being updated. So the load balancer begins to block traffic to the instance, then it will stop the web server on the instance, download the new web application. It will install the application, then start the service back up, and then the load balancer will begin to allow traffic back into the instance. And you likely watch all these different events, and you saw that each EC2 instance was updated one at a time. Now, if we go back to our test page, and if we do a refresh on it, then you see that the page has changed. And well, this web page isn't very fancy, despite its title, but I think you get the point. The AWS CodeDeploy service was able to automatically update our application servers using this web package. Well, so how did this work? How does this actually work? What does the code look like that drives this whole process? Let's take a quick look at that here next. So we'll start by looking at the CodeDeploy template file. This is the CloudFormation template. And we can see that there are a number of different input parameters. We have an AMI that we're defining, a web type, an EC2 instance type, which is a T2 micro by default, and then our auto scaling group size. We have an artifact bucket and an artifact bucket policy. These probably look really familiar to you because they're the same as in the previous hands-on video. Next, we describe a VPC and subnet. All of this should look very familiar to you by now. An elastic load balancing security group, a web server security group. The elastic load balancers allowing traffic into port 80 from everywhere on the internet. The web server security group is allowing traffic in from the load balancer security group. We have an internet gateway. We're attaching that gateway to the VPC. We have a routing table configuration, which is simply routing traffic out to the internet through the internet gateway. Our elastic load balancer, here again, nothing that is nothing that's really new to you. We have our load balancer resource, listener resource, and target group resources. One thing to note, of course, is that we're using an auto-scaling group, right? So we're not defining the targets here within the auto-scaling group. We're defining, within the elastic load balancer, we're defining an auto-scaling group and pointing that auto-scaling group essentially at the elastic load balancer target group. So here's our auto-scaling group, resource definition, and a launch configuration definition. One thing that might look interesting here is this user data. And so we're not using AMIs that have been baked. In other words, we're not pre-installing the software on these AMIs. We're actually installing some software at deploy time. And that's what this user data script is doing. It's basically installing the Nginx web server software. And it's also installing a CodeDeploy agent. And that CodeDeploy agent is needed. It's a necessary part of the EC2 instance configuration, because the AWS CodeDeploy service will communicate with this CodeDeploy agent that is installed. It's a helper application that's installed on the web server, and that's what allows the CodeDeploy service to actually deploy new applications onto the web server. We have a role that we defined for the web servers. The role allows for session manager access, and it also allows for CodeDeploy access. So the CodeDeploy service has to be given access to the web server so that it can communicate with the agent and install software. Additionally, there's a policy for the EC2 instance role, which allows the web server to access our artifact S3 bucket and retrieve the artifact that we want to install, the web server package, the website package that we want to install on the web server. And then finally, here towards the end, we have some CodeDeploy resources. So we have a CodeDeploy application resource that we've defined, and a deployment group resource that's defined. And so the deployment group is referencing an application, which we've defined above, and it's also referencing an auto scaling group. So the deployment group is basically mapped to an auto scaling group, and that describes to the CodeDeploy service what set of servers it should deploy applications to. We have a deployment configuration name, and we're using the one at a time deployment model. We have a couple different options that we can pick from in terms of the actual deployment style. So there are some properties that we can set there. And then we also specify the load balancer target group. And the reason we do that is because the CodeDeploy service will also communicate with the load balancer service and tell the load balancer service when it's updating a particular server in the target group. And when it's updating a server, the load balancer then will stop sending traffic to that instance for a period of time, and until the the instance has been updated properly by the CodeDeploy service. And then finally, there's a service role that's also referenced by the CodeDeploy deployment group. And the service role basically uses a managed policy called AWS CodeDeploy role. And then finally, there are a couple different outputs. We saw these outputs earlier in the video. We saw like the elastic load balancer endpoint address, and we used that to test our web application. Now, one of the other things I want to quickly look at here, kind of wrapping things up, is this website zip file package. We don't really see the contents of this package, but one of the files that's really important to note in this package is a file called Appspec.YAML, and you can actually unzip this website package that you downloaded to see what's in it. But this Appspec.YAML file is really important because this is the configuration file that the CodeDeploy service uses to understand how to deploy the web application. And so this Appspec YAML file, we're specifying the OS as Linux, and we're telling it what files we want to, what files are in the package and where those files need to be stored in the EC2 instance. For example, there's a file where the source is index.html. So the CodeDeploy service is going to download this website.zip file, and it's going to unzip that file. And one of the files in that package is a file called index.html. The CodeDeploy service will then store that index.html file in the specified destination, which is the user share nginx HTML directory, which is the website document root directory for the nginx web server. And there's also another property here, file exists behavior overwrite, which basically says that if that index.html file already exists on that server environment, that the CodeDeploy service should just overwrite it with this new file. And then there are a couple hooks that are defined in the configuration. And what the hooks are really doing is the hooks are triggering the execution of different shell script files based upon lifecycle events. And remember, as the CodeDeploy service was deploying to a particular instance, there were a series of events occurring. And so some of those events can trigger the execution of shell scripts. For example, when at the application start event, the CodeDeploy service will trigger a script called start server. And at the application stop event, it will trigger a script called stop server. And these scripts basically start and stop the nginx service. So very simple, very straightforward. So yeah, that's what the appspec.yaml file is doing. Again, it's just describing actually how the CodeDeploy service should install the application package on each EC2 instance in the target group. You know, the EC2 instances that were created by the auto scaling group. Well, I hope that this video was informative and you learned some new things about the CodeDeploy service. Now, after you're done here, you can, of course, delete the CloudFormation stack to clean up all the resources. Before you do that, you'll want to go into this S3 bucket because remember, CloudFormation can't automatically delete an S3 bucket if it has objects within it. So if we go to our bucket and we just simply delete this object that's in the bucket, then we'll be able to go to our stack and then of course go to the stack and delete the web application stack that we created, and it'll clean up everything that all those different resources that were created by the stack earlier. Well, I hope this was helpful, and on to the next video.